factor, but thrombin can also feed back and activate platelets. Okay, so this is just showing the role of factor 11 here. It's a component of a positive feedback loop. Here's thrombin, and I do have one of these feedback arrows showing 11A gets activated, can further activate factor 9. But it also illustrates why these components here remain superfluous in most in vivo settings of clot. So next thing we want to talk about is the hemostatic balance. So we've talked about our current understanding of the physiologic processes leading to coagulation. Now we're going to talk about the physiologic anticoagulation processes. And it's a balance, right? If there's too much coagulation, one has thrombosis. If there's too much if there's a deficiency of the coagulation factors, we have hemorrhage. And if there's deficiencies of the physiologic anticoagulation, that also leads to thrombosis. So here is the vasculature illustrating its contribution to the physiologic anticoagulation processes. So this is illustrating intact endothelium with anticoagulation surface shown here and here. If you have a gap in the endothelium, platelets adhere, and that starts the coagulation system. But where the endothelial cells are intact, you do not want the blood to clot. So the endothelial cells are the adjudicators, so to speak, on whether the blood is going to clot or not. And there's a range of factors, a range of processes on intact endothelium that inhibit or actually reverse the procoagulant state. Endothelial cells do not activate clotting, which is very important. But beyond that, they actually regulate and reduce the rate of clotting shown here. So there's a lot of these pathways which we're not going to talk about. There's a CD39 or ADP ecto-ADPase that degrades ADP, and as we'll talk about later in the year, ADP activates platelets. Endothelial cells synthesize nitric oxide. Nitric oxide also inhibits smooth muscle contraction and also inhibits platelet function. Cyclooxygenase reduces smooth muscle tension and inhibits platelet function. So these all work to inhibit platelets, which we're not going to discuss today. There are two critical pathways that are endothelial cells dependent that turn off the coagulation system: heparin sulfate using antithrombin, and the thrombomodulin protein C, protein S pathway, which we'll talk about in a few moments. And we already talked about tissue factor pathway inhibitor that blocks the direct conversion of factor 10 to 10A by tissue factor 7 complex. So this is endothelial based, and that's why it only works in vivo, not in vitro, because you don't have endothelial cells there. So we're going to first talk about antithrombin glycosaminoglycan. So antithrombin is a protein that has the ability, the potential to neutralize the enzymes of the coagulation system. However, as antithrombin circulates, it does not bind or neutralize enzymes. This is heparin sulfate, which is a glycosaminoglycan anchored to an endothelial cell here. You can see it looks like a tree in a way. And this is the core protein, and these are the active side chains, the glycosaminoglycan side chains. This is heparin sulfate, and it's chemically very similar to heparin sulfate, as you all know, a very important drug. So in the natural state where the blood is flowing, you do not see any activity here. However, or should I say, so how does this work? That if there's binding of antithrombin, also called antithrombin 3, to glycosaminoglycans, it undergoes a steric alteration takes on the conformation, allowing it to bind to heparin or other enzymes in the clotting cascade. And therefore, it neutralizes the enzyme and dissociates from the heparin sulfate, and the complex is then removed from the circulation in the liver. So just to recapitulate, under physiologic conditions, antithrombins in the flowing, doesn't do anything. When it binds to heparin sulfate or glycosaminoglycan, it becomes activated, or a conformational change, I should say, allowing it to bind to and neutralize the enzymes in the clotting system. And then those are cleared. The second pathway is the protein C, protein S thrombomodulin system. So the heparin antithrombin system neutralizes the enzymes in the clotting system, in the coagulation cascade. And this pathway neutralizes the cofactors. So here's the different constituents, but I'll show you two in cartoon form. It's easier to see. So again, when the thrombin is in circulation, it has the ability to convert fibrinogen to fibrin and other procoagulant activities. So this is its baseline activated activity. However, in the presence of intact endothelial cells, there's a protein called thrombomodulin shown here, anchored to the endothelial cell. And thrombin will then bind to thrombomodulin shown here, and the thrombin is modulated or undergoes a conformational change itself. And when thrombin is bound to thrombomodulin, it no longer has the ability to cleave fibrinogen to form fibrin clots, but now it takes on a novel spectrum of enzymatic activity, and it becomes an anticoagulant. So this is the first step here. Thrombin sees thrombomodulin on an intact endothelial cell, it binds, and it undergoes a conformational change. When thrombin is bound to thrombomodulin on the endothelial cells, it also then gets co-localized to protein C. So this is the endothelial cell protein C receptor, or EPCR. And the EPCR does what its name implies, is it binds protein C, allowing thrombin now to convert protein C to activated protein C, shown here. So again, when the endothelial cells are intact, thrombin is modulated by thrombomodulin and activates protein C to activate protein C. Protein C then uses its receptor protein, its cofactor protein S, and will then cleave and inactivate factor 5A and factor 8A. So this pathway here with thrombomodulin, endothelial protein C receptor, activated protein C, protein S will then neutralize factor 5A and 8A. I didn't put it in here, but there's also believed to be some other roles of the protein C system, possibly fibrinolysis, but this is considered to be the primary role of the protein C pathway. The last of the physiologic processes, last of the physiologic anticoagulation processes affecting the clotting factors, is the fibrinolytic pathway. And it has a range of components listed here, but again, we'll tease this out individually to help you understand it rather than just try to memorize everything. So this is the clot-based fibrinolysis that occurs. So plasminogen, this is an illustration, cartoon form of a fibrin clot. So plasminogen can bind to fibrin. TPA, or tissue plasminogen activator, can bind to fibrin. And when they both bind to fibrin, plasminogen gets converted by TPA to plasmin. So this is a proenzyme or zymogen. Here's the active enzyme. Plasmin, when bound to fibrin, will be like a Pac-Man. It chews it up, and then you have fibrin degradation products. So this is the core of a clot-based fibrinolysis, a clot-based process by which fibrin clots are degraded. There's an alternative way of activating plasmin, though. So here's showing a cell-based mechanism, plasminogen shown here, and then a range of cells, such as prostate cells and some other cells, uterine cells, will have UPAR on the surface, or urokinase plasminogen activator. And urokinase plasminogen activator will bind urokinase, or UPA, and activate it. So this is an alternative mechanism of activating, forming plasmin, separate from a fibrin clot. So here, plasminogen does not have to be anchored to fibrin, but it can still become activated, forming plasmin, and the plasmin then has the ability to bind to a fibrin clot and lysin. So there's two alternative pathways for fibrinolysis to be generated. And for every inducer, every activator, there's always inhibitors, just like we talked about for the heparin antithrombin and the protein C, protein S thrombomodulin system. So just as we have plasminogen has the ability to get converted to plasmin, and there's two inhibitors of plasminogen activators, Pi1 and Pi2, or plasminogen activator 1, plasminogen activator inhibitor 2, shown here. And then there's a plasmin inhibitor, alpha-2 antiplasmin. And there's deficiencies, rare, but there's deficiencies pretty much all of these components. There are deficiencies of plasminogen. There's deficiencies of the Pi1 and Pi2 and alpha-2 antiplasmin. And as you can imagine, an alpha-2 antiplasmin deficiency would be resulting in excessive plasmin activity and bleeding, and deficiencies here would result in excessive plasmin formation as well, and leading to a hemorrhagic state. So that's what we have for now. I've tried to give you guys more than just a simple overview of the cascade. I want you to try to understand some of the key concepts as we talked about. And for instance, the differences in the factors in the intrinsic arm, and the roles of some of these physiologic inhibitors, as well as the role of the thrombin burst. Understanding this will go a long way to allowing us to understand, approach the patient better.